Welcome, everyone. My name is Justin Dyer. I'm a political science professor and director of the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy. We're delighted that you've joined us today for this lecture. It's part of the Black History Month programming at the University of Missouri. It's jointly sponsored by the Department of Political Science, the Truman School of Public Affairs, and the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy. The 2021 Black History Month theme chosen by the Association for the Study of African American Life and History this year is the Black Family: Representation, Identity, and Diversity. We're honored to have Jacqueline C. Rivers join us for a presentation titled Undermining Marriage, White Supremacy, and the Black Family. Dr. Rivers is the Executive Director and Senior Fellow for Social Science and Policy at the Seymour Institute for Black Church and Policy Studies. She served as a lecturer in both sociology and African American studies at Harvard University, and she's presented her research at Princeton, the University of Notre Dame, the University of Pennsylvania, the Vatican, Stanford University, the United Nations, several other venues, including now the University of Missouri. She graduated summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa from Harvard Radcliffe College. She earned her PhD in sociology from Harvard University. And today, just a bit of housekeeping. Dr. Rivers will speak for about 40 minutes. And then if there are questions, or if you have questions, just enter those into the chat function. I will try to keep track of those, or rather into the Q&A function. And if there are questions at the end, I will ask some of those to Dr. Rivers, and we'll try to wrap up right about the hour mark. So thank you again for joining us, Dr. Rivers. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really grateful to you, Justin, for having me, and to the Truman School of Public Affairs and the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy for giving me the opportunity to join you all for Black History Month. I am going to use some slides where I'm talking about statistics, and I thought it might help with a little visualization. So forgive me, going back and forth might be a little tricky. So forgive me if I stumble from time to time switching between screens. So for centuries, the Black community in the United States has faced many formidable obstacles to their prosperity and human flourishing, well known. But it has also included, they're facing barriers to establishing stable families. And there's been a long-running debate over whether the challenges that Black people face are structural in nature, arising from the very way in which society operates, or whether they are cultural, implicating the behavior and values of Black people themselves. Now, in some areas, there's widespread agreement. So, for example, some of the structural issues, the pernicious effects on Black people of prominent problems such as enduring racialized economic injustice, and the recent rise of mass incarceration of young Black men. Those, I think, are largely undisputed, that these are structural problems. But the restriction of African Americans, so for example, the restriction of African Americans largely to menial jobs in the first half of the 20th century, and that's clearly related to the structure of the society rather than to behavioral patterns among Blacks. However, the effects of other issues where structure and culture interact are widely debated. One such area whose importance has been hotly contested is the fractured family structure that is prevalent in the Black community. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, in his infamous report, portrayed the lower-class Black family as a tangle of pathology. Such terminology implies that the actions and attitudes of poor Blacks were the source of the problem. Yet at the same time, Moynihan attributed the failure of these families to poor Black men's lack of access to jobs that paid a living wage. In addition, many scholars, Carol Stack is notable among them, have defended the extended family structure that was prevalent among poor Blacks as an effective alternative to the traditional family. This talk reflects on the state of the Black family in light of how racial injustice and social transformation, both structural and cultural realities, have undermined the practice of marriage among Black people. To get started, here's a very brief overview of the developments I'll discuss. During the earliest phase of African American life, slave laws prohibited Blacks from entering into legal marriage. Following emancipation, the freed people acted swiftly to rectify this and took advantage of the opportunity to legalize their common law marriages. However, as a great migration took Blacks to the cities of the North and West, the persistent employment challenges faced by poor Black men further eroded the basis of marriage. More recently, de-industrialization and mass incarceration have exacerbated challenges to Black marriages. In addition, extensive structural and cultural changes in the broader society have added to the mounting problems. These include the greatly expanded integration of women into the workforce and changing attitudes towards marriage. This complex interaction of structure and culture has produced a situation in which marriage rates among Blacks at all levels of economic status lag behind those of their white counterparts. I will close with a few thoughts, just minor suggestions on how we might address this situation, recognizing the difficulty of any such effort, and that it would be imperative to combine initiatives that speak to both cultural and structural aspects of the problem. Before examining the dynamics that have impacted the Black family, let's start by assessing the condition of Black families in the recent past and currently. There's been a marked retreat from marriage in the US, and I think this is doubtlessly a familiar story to many of you. And these changes have affected Blacks more than any other demographic group. In the 40-year span between 1970 and 2010, the percent of Black women between the ages of 40 and 44 who were married fell from 61% to just 37%, and close to a 50% drop. I'm going to share my screen for some of these data. So, a little trouble getting there. So you see here a chart of from the Pew Research Center on the share of never married people by race and ethnicity between 1960 and 2008. And the pale green line is among Blacks, and you will see that never married, in 1960, there's not a great deal of racial difference. And it's only 70% for Blacks in 1960 who have never married. But by the time we get to 2008, that figure has risen to 44% of Blacks having never been married. It also rises among whites, but not as steeply. So in 1960, it's 14%, and by 2008, it's up to 23%. So Blacks have long had a lower rate of marriage than whites, but the racial gap widened considerably over the roughly 5 decades that are shown here. It's also interesting, and also I think probably well known to many of you, that a similar pattern exists across class lines. Right now, the gap is widest between those with some college and college graduates. And the share of never married among those with some college was at 22% in 1960 and rose to 32% by 2008. Among college grads, it started out at 18% and rose to 21% by 2008. The gap between those individuals with some college and college graduates in terms, shrank slightly in terms of the ratios. However, there was a marked secular upward trend among individuals with less than a high school education who had the lowest rates of never being married in 1960, but whose rates were very close to the highest in 2008. And the question of education level is important because in general, Blacks have lower than average levels of education compared to the general population in the US. This accounts in part for the low rates of marriage among Blacks. The authors of this analysis from Pew report that economic concerns, which are clearly related to education levels, are probably implicated in lower marriage rates among Blacks. Not only are socioeconomic levels lower among Blacks, but concern about a marriage partner's ability to provide economic support are considerably greater. So you see here in this chart that among Blacks, 50% think that it's very important for a woman to be a good provider. 88% think it's very important for a man to be a good provider. Especially in terms of men, that's much higher than among whites, where it's only 62%. This may well, the fact that Blacks are more concerned about this may well be due to greater levels of economic insecurity among Blacks. Even more recent data is available from the Pew Research Center. A 2019 report shows that marriage rates remain very low, even as there has been an uptick in the practice of cohabitation. So this is data on those who were married or cohabitating at the point at which the data was collected. And you can see that 57% of whites were married at that point, and only 33% of Blacks. They also found that at this point, in terms of looking at even though the percentage of people who were married was much greater than the percent of those who were cohabiting, that if you look over the lifetime among people between the ages of 18 and 44, a greater percentage of them had at some point been cohabiting, 59%, versus those who had at some point been married, which was only 50%. So in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, marriage declined substantially in this demographic, 18 to 44, falling from 60% to 50%, according to the Pew analysis of one database. And marriage rates are down compared to 1995, based on their analysis of the population survey. And this is just data on, what you're seeing now is data on the percent living with children. It's still much greater that those who are married are living with children. 70% of those married are living with children, and only 35% of those cohabiting are living with children. Blacks are much less likely to be married than our other racial or ethnic groups. Only 33% of Blacks were married in 2018, compared to 57% of whites. I'll stop sharing for a moment And this represents a decline in rates for both groups. There were also marked differences by level of education, with only 54% of individuals with a high school education or less being married, compared to 66% of those with a college education or better. Again, since Blacks on average are less educated than the general population, some of the racial difference in marriage rates is explained by educational differences between the races. The patterns for out-of-wedlock childbearing mirror those of marriage. In 1965, when Moynihan wrote his infamous report, The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, 25% of all Black babies were born out of wedlock. Among white women, the figure was just 3.1%. Almost 50 years later, in 2010, 40% of all births were to unmarried women. That's almost half. Among white women, 29% of all births were out of wedlock. So this is higher than the rate that existed among Black women when Moynihan wrote his report. And among Black women, the proportion was 73%. Unmarried white women were having babies at a higher rate than Black women were when Moynihan sounded the alarm about poor Black single women having children. And the rate among Black women was almost 3 times what it had been at that point. Here is a trend line. You can see that this top line is non-marital births among Blacks, and this is between 1990 and 2010. It's always much higher among Blacks, but it pretty much levels off in 1995 and just fluctuates slightly up to 2010, whereas there's a slight upward trend among white women over a secular trend over that period. In 2018, which is the most recently available data, the rate of out-of-wedlock births in the nation was just under 40 births out of every 100. And that, as I said earlier, is almost half of all births. And this is the lowest rate since 2007. The rate peaked in 2009 at 41%. Since 2005, roughly 7 out of every 10 births among Black women has been to unwed mothers. And the figure was 72% in 2010, which was possibly the highest level it had reached. It has declined recently it has declined a little in recent years and is down to 69% in 2018, or just over 69%. According to Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and George Akerlof, the policy implications of the increase in out-of-wedlock births are staggering. So it's very concerning to them that we are having this kind of rise in out-of-wedlock births. Akerlof and Yellen's concerns about the rise in out-of-wedlock births are related to the increase in female-headed households that goes along with that. The US Census Bureau reported that between 1960 and 2016, the percentage of all US children living in families with 2 parents decreased from 88 to 69. By 2020, the share of children living with 2 married parents was 71% for white children, but only 38% for Black children. The consequences of failed families are dire for women and children. As Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and George Akerlof state, if we have learned any policy lesson well over the past 25 years, it is that for children living in single-parent homes, the odds of living in poverty are great. What's interesting is that is from an article written in 1996, which was just republished on the Brookings website. The Children's Defense Fund reports that in 2020, more than 1 in 6 children under the age of 6 were poor, and almost half of them lived in extreme poverty. Nearly 1 in 3 Black children were poor. That's 30%, compared to 1 in 11 white children, 8%. So the rates are much higher for Black children than for whites. The economic impact of being a single mother is so significant that it may be more important than race in some instances. Although Blacks experience much higher rates of poverty than whites do, white households headed by single mothers in 1970 were twice as likely to be poor as Black married couples. So even though typically Black people are poorer, marriage makes such a difference. White children being raised by single mothers were more likely to be in poor households than Black children in 2-parent families, reversing the usual racial dynamic. White single mother households, those from which fathers were absent, were also 5 times more likely to be poor than white married couples. This illustrates the high levels of economic disadvantage associated with father-absent households. Though it's really important to acknowledge that, as I've noted above, individuals with higher socioeconomic status are more likely to be married than are the poor. So there are a couple of sources driving this relationship. When Black father-absent households are considered, the situation is even more desperate, since these households experience more poverty than those headed by white women. In 2011, 46% of all families headed by single Black women were poor, compared to only 12% of those headed by a Black married couple. So 46% of Black single parent households, only 12% of those headed by a Black married couple. According to Harvard sociologist Robert Sampson and his colleague Douglas Massey, in 2000, over 50% of children in father-absent households were poor, and half of those were extremely poor. Research has shown that children suffer from reduced levels of economic resources in single-parent households compared to those living with married parents, even when transfer parents and payments and taxes are taken into account. And the same is true of children living in cohabiting households. The shortage of resources and limitations on parental attention, because it's not just that these families are poorer, it's also that children simply have less access to attention, parental attention. And these have lasting negative effects on the next generation. Children raised in single-parent households perform less well on standardized tests and have lower grades in school. These children also suffer more behavioral and psychological problems, and these deficits persist into adulthood. They don't end when children grow up. According to a review of the literature by Paul Amato, compared with children who grow up in stable two-parent families, children born outside marriage reach adulthood with less education, earn less income, have lower occupational status, are more likely to be idle, that is, not employed and not in school, and are more likely to have non-marital births among daughters, have more troubled marriages, experience higher rates of divorce, and report more symptoms of depression. These effects are more keenly felt in the Black community, where fewer children are being raised in households with two married parents. However, it's not only children who suffer. Single adults forego positive effects that have been found to be associated with marriage. Marriage is associated with substantially higher wages for men, and at least one study concludes that marriage contributes in a causal fashion to those higher wages, so that marriage actually causes. It's not just that those who are better off who get married, but also once you're married, men actually earn higher wages. Married men report less depression than their unmarried peers. They're less likely to engage in risky behavior and more likely to live healthier lifestyles. Married women report fewer problems with alcohol. Both men and women are likely to live longer if married, even when selection effects are taken into account. All these benefits of marriage are enjoyed by fewer Blacks as a result of their low marriage rates. So having outlined the retreat from marriage in detail, looked at its consequences for children and the prominent racial disparities that are involved, let's consider the factors that have contributed to this situation. Special attention will be paid to structural factors that arise from white supremacy and that impact Black people in the US. Scholars such as the prominent Harvard sociologist Orlando Patterson argue that the pattern of male-female relationships imposed on enslaved people has created a cultural retention that still resonates in the Black family today. Slaves could not legally be married, a fact that inhibited the creation of a culture based on stable marriages. Slavery had a particularly devastating effect on the role of husband and father. Slaveholders, rather than parents, were for the most part the source of material support. They had virtually complete control over most aspects of the family's life. Neither parent could protect their children from the cruelty of masters, and men could not effectively defend their women from the predations of the master. All of this was true in an age when men were largely unchallenged as protectors and providers. Furthermore, slave marriages were often between men and women who lived on different farms, since most enslaved people lived on small holdings with only a small number of their pairs and with very few other slaves who were not blood relatives. It was not uncommon for abroad husbands, as they were known, to need a pass to visit their common law wives on a different small holding, and for them to see their wives only a few times per week. This created room for infidelity, especially among men, which could be quite corrosive to marriage. To make matters horribly worse, women were often raped by their masters, further undermining the attempt to forge a marital bond. Perhaps most devastating was the practice of selling enslaved people away from their families, a further hindrance to familial stability. Historians suggest that slaveholders on the mid-Atlantic seaboard may well have encouraged the production of the maximum number of offspring among slaves to fuel the internal slave trade, particularly after the official end of the transatlantic slave trade. This motivated slaveholders to treat enslaved men as studs and women as breeders, promoting sexual liaisons wherever possible, regardless of enslaved people's commitments to common law spouses. There is some evidence that supports this conclusion in the work of sociologist Philip Morgan, who has found that even in the early 20th century, female-headed households were already more common among Blacks than whites. However, despite the horrific conditions they lived under, enslaved people formed deep, lasting, and meaningful familial bonds. And this is very evident from the work of Eugene Genovese. The most powerful evidence of this is a large number of freed men and women who formalized their common law marriages after emancipation and the immediacy with which they acted. According to Laura Edwards, in July 1865, an Episcopal minister in Warren County, North Carolina, married 150 African-American couples in just 2 days. However, in the violent slave system created by white supremacy, key aspects of marriage, its permanence and exclusivity, were massively undermined. The pattern of family relationships that was arguably established under slavery was reinforced subsequently by white supremacy through many of the structural conditions that African Americans faced. As Blacks moved north and west in the Great Migration, they faced virulent racism that trapped them in ghettos, restricting access to quality education and severely limiting job opportunities. African Americans' access to the most important developments that created the white middle class, the New Deal, was deliberately limited by racist Southern Democrats in Congress. As a result, the labor categories in which Blacks were most heavily represented, domestic workers and farm laborers, were excluded from Social Security and unemployment insurance. In addition, the administration of these programs was devolved to local and state officials who in the South excluded Blacks from many of the benefits due them. African Americans who were already disproportionately poor were effectively largely cut out from the safety net created under Franklin D. Roosevelt. Similar tactics limited Blacks' access to the benefits provided by the GI Bill: housing, education, and occupational training. According to the analysis of the eminent political scientist Ira Katz-Nelson, this is the most important contributing factor to the enduring racial wealth gap between Blacks and whites. The GI Bill was the engine that created the white middle class, giving white veterans and their families a leg up in the acquisition of homes in particular, but also in careers. The result of the systemic exclusion of African Americans was that they were vastly disadvantaged economically, and that handicap has only grown over many decades as the value of homes owned by whites has consistently climbed. The pressures of poverty in which the majority of Black families were trapped further undermined the stability of African American marriages. Black men's employment opportunities suffered particularly during the early 20th century. A combination of nakedly racist hiring practices and the exclusion of Black workers from unions led to their holding the most menial, lowest paid positions, even when they possessed the skills for better jobs. By the middle of the 20th century, Black men often bore a particular burden, earning less than a living wage. They were frequently unable to meet the expectations of wives and children. The disappointment that families felt was combined with men's sense of failure and perhaps guilt when they were unable to provide for their families. In addition to suffering low wages, Black men struggled with high rates of unemployment, which had dogged them for decades and which grew worse in the 1960s. None of this conducive to healthy families or marriages. De-industrialization had a devastating effect on Black men. Barry Bluestone, the premier scholar of the phenomenon, defines de-industrialization as the widespread systematic disinvestment in the nation's basic productive capacity, which led to the loss of many manufacturing jobs to factories in developing nations. In addition, the automation of many of these jobs further reduced the demand for labor. Bluestone and his colleague report that 32 to 38 million jobs were lost in the 1970s due to disinvestment. They found that workers paid a high price. Up to 30% of displaced workers experienced extended periods of unemployment. For many, there were long-term pay cuts and loss of occupational status. Many found jobs only in the secondary labor market. In addition, workers lost pensions and health insurance. These effects were greatest for African Americans who were concentrated in inner cities and the regions of the country that lost the most jobs. In addition, they were heavily represented in the industries that were most affected and were usually the last hired and therefore the first fired. As a result, the employment prospects of poorly educated men in general have fallen as manufacturing jobs have moved overseas or been automated and the service industry has expanded. Men with less than a college degree have increasingly found it difficult to find a job, especially one that pays well. And as noted before, these developments have hit Black communities the hardest. Closely associated with these economic pressures were marital conflict, infidelity, and broken families. This was, in fact, the central claim of the infamous Moynihan Report, that marital stability among working-class Blacks was closely linked to unemployment among men. The famed sociologist William Julius Wilson has argued that poor Black men have become less marriageable as a result of the effects of de-industrialization and the movement of jobs out of inner cities to the suburbs. Low wages and joblessness that resulted from the operation of white supremacy in the form of racial barriers in the labor market are not the only structural issues that have undermined the institution of marriage among the Black poor. Black families and communities have been devastated by the phenomenon of racialized mass incarceration. This too is a familiar story. Let me share some slides on this. The prison population in the United States exploded in the last 2 decades of the 20th century. Between 1980 and 2000, the number of people incarcerated in prison in the United States rose from 300,000 to over 1 million. In contrast to this astronomical increase of more than 700,000 prisoners in only 20 years, the prison population grew by only 285,000 in the prior century. 100 years, the population grew by 285,000. In the subsequent 20 years, it grew by 700,000. According to the latest data available, the American incarceration rate, and what you're seeing here on this slide is actually not the very latest data, but it's the best graphic that's available at the moment. The American incarceration rate of 698 per 100,000 far outstrips that of any other developed nation. And this was data from 2015. It is the second highest in the world. So America has made some improvement, used to be the worst. Now the Seychelles beats out the American incarceration rate. Rates of imprisonment in the US are more extreme than even in nations such as Russia, Cuba, and South Africa. In fact, in the latest data, South Africa doesn't even make it into the top level. So here is the US. This was data from a couple of years ago, and you see that here is the US out here at 738. It's the longest bar at the bottom of that chart. And South Africa is up here at 306. So we're looking at much more extreme levels of incarceration in the United States. The Russian Federation is at 607 in that data set. So they are still far outstripped by the United States. Not only does the United States imprison men, because typically men are incarcerated at much higher rates than women. In the early 2000s, more than 90% of all prisoners were male. Not only are they incarcerating men at astronomical rates, but the racial inequities are egregious. I know that this is a familiar story. The Pew Research Center reported in 2020 that the nation's imprisonment rate in 2018 was at its lowest level in more than 2 decades. So improvement, lowest level. They go on to say that the greatest decline has come among Black Americans whose imprisonment rate in 2018 had decreased 34% since 2006. Nonetheless, the racial imbalance is still severe. According to the report, the Black imprisonment rate at the end of 2018 was nearly twice the rate among Hispanics. And this is actually shown in this graphic. The Black imprisonment rate at the end of 2018 was nearly twice the rate among Hispanics and more than 5 times the rate among whites. There were 1,501 Black prisoners for every 100,000 Black adults at the end of 2018. And this graphic is a little difficult to read, but here in the middle are imprisonment rates, the gold dots. So the US prison population is 33%. And if you look to the left of that, that's for Black people, 33%. And the share of the US adult population is only 12%. The prison population for whites is 30%, and their share of the US adult US adult population is 63%. So you see that the inequity is grave. And the reason I have this older graphic is because I think it's much easier to read, and the data has changed very little between these two. Between 2016 and 2018, there was very little change. So in terms of the proportions. So the numbers are down, but the proportions have not changed very much. So whites at that point were 64% of the population, but only 30% of prison population. Blacks were 12% of the US population, but 33% of the prison population. The disparity is more clearly outlined in that graphic. The report indicates that Black men are still much more at risk for imprisonment than are Black women. These increases in incarceration are largely due to changes in sentencing guidelines that created mandatory minimum sentences and laws that require judges to impose a sentence of life imprisonment for the third offense, even if crimes were nonviolent. So these increases, the increases in incarceration that started at the end of the in the 1980s and later were caused by these two things: mandatory minimum sentences and 3-strike laws. The prosecution of the war on drugs and the disproportionate sentencing for drug crimes involving crack cocaine versus much lighter sentences for the use and sale of powdered cocaine contributed to the extreme racial inequity. While the laws are race neutral on the face of it, they had massively disproportionate impact on the Black community. And the fact that these laws, which have now been reformed at the federal level, endured for as long as they did, raises questions about the role of white supremacy in their continuation and in their dissemination across many states. Incarceration has become the modal experience for young Black men with less than a high school diploma. It is more common for a poorly educated young Black man to go to prison than it is for him to attend college, belong to a union, or join the armed forces. 1/3 of all men in this category will be incarcerated at some point over the course of their lives. Furthermore, the experience changes the trajectory of a man's life, reducing his chances of graduating from college or holding a stable job. It also reduces his earning power upon release from prison. One result of disproportionate incarceration is an imbalanced sex ratio in poor Black neighborhoods. Fewer men are available for marriage because they are imprisoned. Furthermore, the men who are available are seen as less marriageable because they often have a criminal record and therefore less earning power than men with a comparable education. The labor market challenges that men face the problems of mass incarceration, and the legal limitation on marriage and family under slavery are all structural barriers, more or less closely tied to white supremacy, that have greatly reduced Blacks' likelihood to marry. However, let's turn now towards some changes that affect the society at large, both structural and cultural. The entry of large numbers of women into the labor force has changed the relationship between husbands and wives significantly. As women have acquired greater economic independence, they've been less prone to remain in unhappy marriages, more likely to seek divorce. They've also experienced less pressure to enter into marriage and have done so later in life than was true during the heyday of companionate marriage in the 1950s. This represents a significant shift in attitudes towards marriage. The result has been a substantial retreat from marriage, especially among less prosperous Americans, a trend that has also contributed to the declining marriage rates among Blacks. Technological and social developments have also had an important impact on marriage. Since the middle of the 20th century, birth control techniques have become accessible to unmarried couples and are generally more readily available and more effective. In addition, abortion on demand has become the law of the land. These two developments have contributed to the decoupling of sex from childbearing and marriage, which ironically has in turn promoted lower marriage rates and an increase in out-of-wedlock childbearing, which we've seen has been extremely harmful to children. According to Andrew Cherlin, a leading scholar of family life, the very culture of marriage has shifted. Roles for husbands and wives are more likely to be negotiated. Spouses tend to be oriented towards self-fulfillment rather than self-giving love. For many poor women, marriage has become a capstone experience which crowns economic achievement and the testing of a partnership through cohabitation. Evolving attitudes towards marriage appear to have played an important role in the retreat from marriage in the general population, as well as among African Americans. I had some thoughts about some cultural trends among Blacks, but I'm running short on time. So I want to make sure that I don't run over. Okay. Give me a moment while There are additional cultural issues that appear to be more prominent among African Americans. Earlier in this talk, I discussed the connection between race and class and the retreat from marriage. The effects of race and class are almost inextricably intertwined due to very substantial overrepresentation of Blacks among the poor and working class, and due to unparalleled levels of poverty among Blacks in some locations. However, by focusing on patterns of behavior among middle-class Blacks, some of the effects of class may be controlled. From this perspective, there's some evidence that racial differences in socioeconomic status are not adequate to explain the retreat from marriage among Blacks. In his book, Is Marriage for White People, Ralph Richard Banks makes a convincing argument that Black men, in particular, highly educated, well-paid Black men, are not marrying because there is a shortage of men with those characteristics, and because there's a relative superabundance of successful, well-educated Black women. Because there's so few highly educated Black men and so many accomplished Black women, these men may maintain relationships with multiple Black women, having all the benefits of female companionship and sex without the obligations of marriage. Their female pairs have little choice but to accept these conditions because men are in such short supply. The distrust resulting from multi-partner relationships leads to deteriorating gender relations, with men growing increasingly exacting in their standards for marriage and wanting to marry only the perfect woman, no woman good enough. Concurrently, women come to expect expensive outings and gifts to compensate for male infidelity. Men then feel used and reject the women whom they see as exploitative. Much of Banks' data verges on the anecdotal, but he also refers to a host of studies that support the contention that Black men having more sexual partners than men, that Black men have more sexual partners than men from other racial and ethnic groups. William Mosher and his colleagues found that 21.7% of Black men had 3 or more sexual partners in the past 12 months, compared with 14.3% of Hispanic men, and 7.6% of white men. So 21% of Black men, 7% of white men. There is also evidence from a 1998 study by Orlando Patterson that tends to support Banks' analysis. Patterson found that Black women were far more sexually conservative than Black men. While it is not uncommon for American women to be more conservative than men in this area, the gender gap is much more prominent among Blacks than among whites or Hispanics. In addition, Patterson found that the gap on sexual issues extends beyond their opinions to stated commitments to their behavior. Black men have not only different sexual values than Black women, they also have higher rates of infidelity, whether married or unmarried. So I just wanted to quickly say that maybe there's some things that can be done about this. Some tentative steps. First of all, even in the current polarized political climate, there's still bipartisan support around one issue of paramount importance to Blacks and of great relevance to families: mass incarceration. Some steps have already been taken to address the problem at the federal level, and we've seen a decline in incarceration numbers, and especially among Blacks, but it requires a state-by-state approach to the problem because most prisoners are held in state institutions. So the laws that drove mass incarceration, mandatory minimum sentences, three-strike laws, need to be reformed with bipartisan support at the state level. And alternative sentencing for nonviolent offenses, which prevent men from being incarcerated, is especially important. More must be done on this front. Bruce Weston's work demonstrates that there is a connection between incarceration and poor marriage experiences. Other public policy interventions might revolve around increasing the earning power of poorly educated Black men. A study of fragile families found that a substantial rise in men's income would have a positive effect on marriage, even if only a small one. Increasing educational opportunities for poor youth would also be important, and all of these would have disproportionate effects on Black people because we are overrepresented in those areas. I would just add one idea on the cultural front. Some research has shown that there's an association between beliefs regarding marriage and church attendance. Both Black and white women who attended church regularly were more likely to disapprove of premarital sex, though the relationship was stronger among whites. Research by Wilcox and Wolfinger found that not only were attitudes different among women who were frequent churchgoers, but marriage rates were higher and out of wedlock birth rates lower. However, effects were stronger among whites and among Black women. So it appears that there's a role that civil society could play, that churches could be dealing with this and increasing the focus on encouraging a retreat from premarital sex, so that in fact we might have a situation where children are disadvantaged being raised by single parents. In sum, structural disadvantages and cultural patterns have led fewer Black people to participate in marriage, which has hurt large numbers of Black children. Many sociologists recognize this has created a downward spiral in which the disadvantages of one generation lead to lower levels of well-being in the next. However, it is possible that some of the things that I've suggested might be able to begin to reverse some of these trends. Thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you for that presentation. I said we would wrap up about the hour mark, but we might push a little bit beyond that because we have some great questions in the Q&A function. You anticipated a lot of them, or they anticipated your presentation. They were coming in as you were talking, and I think you've addressed some of these already, but let me go through and ask a few of these. One of them, I think it gets at the framework that you presented between structural and cultural interactions and challenges.
Yeah.
And the question is this: looking strictly at the data presented or cited, where is the titled white supremacy correlation with marriage statistics? Are there other inferences that can be made, such as location demographics, religious ideologies, education levels, household doctrine, head of household norms, etc., rather than simply white supremacy. And I might rephrase it a bit and ask whether what you're talking about when you say white supremacy is the same as the structural challenges that you went through. So the history of slavery, racist labor policies, barriers to homeownership, mass incarceration, or whether it's different than that.
No,
so
exactly.
An invitation to talk a little bit.
Thank you so much, Justin. I really appreciate that question. I think it's important to, and I tried to point to some of the cultural factors towards the end of the talk. I shortened that because I realized I was going too long. So I don't want to negate that there are cultural factors. However, you put your finger on it, Justin. A lot of the white supremacy gets embedded in the structure of the society. So if you look at slavery, it appears both from the work of Patterson and Morgan to have had an impact on out-of-wedlock birth rates and single-headed households. That's clearly coming out of white supremacy. The fact that Black people were enslaved and white people were slaveholders clearly related to white supremacy. As you point out then, that plays out in the 20th century in the form of Blacks being locked out of unions and therefore having lower wages. They are being locked into more menial, lower paying jobs. And even in the New Deal, which was this huge engine creating the white middle class, you have a situation where Blacks are deliberately excluded by leaving out the two categories in which they were most represented, farm laborers and domestic workers. Follows up the same thing in the GI Bill. This was deliberately done. The work of Ara Katz-Nelson documents this very powerfully. One of my favorite books, When Affirmative Action Was, wait for it, white. When affirmative action was white. The fact that the GI Bill and the New Deal really benefited white families, catapulting them into the middle class and deliberately left Black families behind. So absolutely, these structural factors. Obviously, what's happening with mass incarceration is less deliberately white supremacist, but it definitely has had a massively disproportionate racial effect that you had laws that made crack cocaine have much higher levels of much longer terms of imprisonment, whereas powder cocaine was treated much more leniently. Big disproportionate impact.
Thank you. There were several variations of a similar kind of question, and it was what explains the seemingly very significant trends after the Moynihan Report, so after the 1960s, with respect to family structure, both among white families and Black families. And speaking directly to some of the evidence you presented, you have a lot of the structural disadvantages that you cite comes before that report, but you have a lot of changes after that report, and a lot of that possibly predates the mass incarceration rates that you talk about in the last 20 years of the 20th century. So talking a little bit about what's going on across the broad sweep of the 20th century.
So I certainly agree that most of the structural challenges I outlined predate the Moynihan Report, but two things are happening. One is, you point out, you have mass incarceration that starts in the 80s and which arguably has an impact. Now, remember, even when Moynihan writes about this, he's distinguishing patterns among poor Blacks from middle-class Blacks, and he is identifying poor Blacks as having these fractured family structures, not making the same claim about middle-class Blacks. So so that's the first thing. However, the effects of the civil rights movement further widens the gap between poor Blacks and middle-class Blacks, so that now, currently, and in fact, this has been true for some time, levels of intra-racial family inequality are highest among Black families. So the gap between the rich and the poor is greatest among Blacks. So you have Black people, you have poor people, Black people who are trapped in poverty. They then face, and this happens in the 80s, you have in the 70s into the 80s, you have de-industrialization. So that what was a route out of poverty, because you could have a high school education and get a job that paid well, and you could earn enough money to send your children to college, that route is closed off as access to those jobs, as these jobs go overseas, or more significantly, they're automated. And they move out of the inner city. This is a work of William Julius Wilson. It's been documented by subsequent quantitative work that shows that jobs moved out of the inner city. So a lot of the family breakdown that is happening in the inner city is not as explicitly white supremacist, but definitely poor Blacks are experiencing structural challenges. And I outlined a little bit some cultural challenges then, and there are culturally related patterns that develop. I'm not trying to suggest that there aren't cultural patterns among poor Blacks. Cultural patterns do develop, but there are also some pernicious effects among middle-class Blacks that I referred to, which is you have these well-educated, well-paid Black men who don't see the need to marry. Why pay for the cow when you can get the milk for free? There's so many well-established, well-educated, middle-class Black women that it is, no, I want to say that this is more of a hypothesis. You know, I don't think Banks did the kind of work that allows us to say this with complete confidence, but there are indications, not just from his work, but the other studies that I cited, that there may well be this tendency for middle-class Black men to not get married because of so few Black men are making it to that level in society. And there is data that shows that even among middle classes, Blacks have retreated from marriage more than whites have.
All right, thank you. Another question that's recurring in different ways, and I'm going to group a few different questions together here.
Sure.
The first is marriage really the answer? Another way of asking is, are there other ways that we could address this problem in society without addressing marriage, which seems to have had trends across the board in all sorts of different groups?
Yes, yes.
And then related to that, do we really want marriage? Doesn't marriage benefit men more than women with respect to earnings and professional advancement? One of the statistics you cited was that men's earnings go up if they're married, and there wasn't a correlative statistic for women for that. And then a related, so if you could keep these all in mind, and then a related one is about the rise of interracial marriage. Yes. And how that affects this dynamic, and particularly Black men marrying outside of their race, as the question was phrased, and whether that hurts marriage prospects for Black women. Okay. So kind of a lot of different questions there.
You have to remind me. I do want to go back to one thing that came from the other question. It is true that there are trends across the society that have nothing to do with race, which have undermined marriage. Coming from the very surprising Janet Yellen and George Akerlof, their study that found that access to birth control and to abortion had really decoupled sex, marriage, and childbearing, which further undermined marriage, not among Blacks, but just in the society at large, just generally. So I do want to acknowledge that to some extent, Blacks are kind of the canary in the coal mine, that what happens in the Black community, it happens there first, and then you see it roll out in the rest of the society. Do we really want marriage? Well, given that Americans are not strongly inclined towards strengthening the safety net, seems to me that we're between a rock and a hard place. So in the Nordic countries, they have very strong means of caring for children and lots of supports in place, which one might argue makes marriage less vital. We can see why marriage matters here. Marriage matters especially for children. Children are not well served. And even in cohabiting couples, that in the United States has not been a good place for children, because cohabitation in the United States tends to be unstable. In Europe, cohabitation tends to be more long-term, so I think the effects are not as detrimental. So given that Americans don't stay in cohabitation for long, given that it seems near impossible, especially in the current political climate, to put in place a kind of social security net that would allow single women to do well raising children, which is not to say all of them fail, right? The last president was a son of a single mom. Not to say all of them fail, but that on the whole, this is a downward spiral where disadvantage in one generation gets amplified at the next generation and so on down the line. So it seems to me that we're between a rock and a hard place. How do we either improve on marriage, or how do we put in place the safety net that would be necessary to make marriage less important? Does it benefit men more than women? I do think that the research shows that it benefits men more than women, but women also tend to earn more when they're married. So I can see the question, and there are other advantages that women have. Women suffer less from depression, and there are other benefits that come with marriage. But I do think the literature tends to show that men benefit more from marriage. The question about marriage among Blacks, those rates are still very low. They are at 3 times the rate among men, Black men, and they have been for decades. They're down a little bit. The ratio is down a little bit, but generally, Black men are marrying out at roughly 3 times the rate of Black women, but those are still very low rates. Blacks marry out at the lowest rates among any racial group, and that has increased substantially among Hispanics and Asians, but still very low among Blacks. I do think that it has negative impacts on marriage prospects for Black women. But of all the problems we face, that may be the most difficult to address.
Thank you. This is going to take you outside of your wheelhouse, and so you can punt on it if you don't have a good frame of reference for it, but it's a question about global trends. And so focusing not just on the United States, but if we look globally and look at trends about marriage and family structure in other societies, does that tell us anything about what's going on here? And I think the question was motivated in part by asking if there's a unique racial dynamic at work in the United States such that we should see this looking unique compared to other countries.
That's really a good question. And you are quite right, Justin, that that's outside my wheelhouse. I am aware, as I mentioned, that, you have that cohabitation has been more common in Europe and tends to be more stable. Therefore, better outcome for children, and that there are stronger supports, social supports for raising children outside of marriage. But I'm afraid that I don't know what the trends are. And in general, though, I think the instinct behind the question, there's some support for it, that things tend to be more difficult here in the United States and easier in Nordic countries where you have a more homogeneous population. So I think the instinct behind the question, there's some support for that things may be more difficult here precisely because of the racial dynamics.
Thank you. Okay, I've got 2 more for you. One is, I think, just a quick one, but it's, have we seen an uptick in Black marriage rates in the last few years tied to recent economic trends, job opportunities and prospects and things of that nature with tracking the economy, probably prior to coronavirus and all the challenges that has posed?
I'm not aware of anyone having done research on that, and I'm not aware of any uptick in marriage rates among any groups. And one has to remember that the Black unemployment rate is always so much higher, usually, again, 3 times higher than unemployment rates among whites. So, and remember, the dynamics at the top of the ladder are probably different. It's not so much about unemployment. That's much more true among poor Blacks. And Orlando Patterson found that rates of infidelity were highest in his study among men who were richest and men who were poorest. But there are very different dynamics going on. And I don't know that there's been enough effect on poor men for us to see an impact on marriage rates. I also want to say that even though I pointed to improving economic prospects as a way of possibly impacting marriage, once a cultural trend has taken hold, it's going to be difficult to do that. And the study that did find an improvement on marriage rates as a result of improving income only found a small effect. So to be honest, it's really difficult to see how we're going to turn it around.
Well, very helpful. And this, I think, goes into the way that you just ended that comment. And it's a variation of this was coming up over and again in the Q&A, and it's what do we do? And so if you had addressed it a bit at the end when you were talking about possible policy tools that we might have, but if you had the ability to enact certain policies and you could focus on just a few, and you had mentioned mass incarceration, but what would those policies look like?
Well, I definitely work on mass incarceration. I would also really work on education because it is, you saw the data. It's the highly educated individuals who are still getting married and who are having children in marriage, which is the benefit of the children, as well as the data seems to indicate benefits for both men and women. So that I would really work on education. Can we get kids educated? Can we help them have an investment in their future so that there's a reason not to have a child out of wedlock, to delay childbearing? That there is, the work of Kathy Eden and Maria Kafalas seems to point to a question of having, that some poor women were having children in order to have an identity. My identity is mother. But they suggest that if we could help these young women find more of an identity in work, there would be less impulse. So some women were deliberately having children. There'd be less of an impulse to have a child in order to establish an identity. So 3 things I'd work on: mass incarceration. Can we improve educational outcomes? Get people college educated, because that's really the barrier. People need the equivalent post-college. It may not be BA, but the kind of training that allows them to access good employment. I think that's really important. Those are the places that I would be focusing my efforts if I ruled the world.
Well, that's very, very helpful. Dr. Rivers, thank you for joining us today. This was a wonderful presentation. I think, judging from all of the different comments, many that we didn't get a chance to address, you had an audience that was very engaged and interested in what you had to say, and we appreciate you taking time this afternoon for us.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure, and I think this is such an important issue. Thank you for focusing attention on it.
Thank you.